English translation 586th Contact Friday, the 2nd of May 2014, 22:33 hours.
Edward, here I am. Greetings, dear friend.
You called me just now, when I was out of the kitchen, where I had talked to Erhard and Hartmut. That must have been less than a minute ago. Greetings also to you, Ta, dear friend, and above all, welcome. But why are you coming today, since you said on the 18th of April that you wanted to come here on the 3rd of May for the correction work?
That work will be done tomorrow by Florina, since I will be absent. Because I have to see my daughter Simya Se during the night, in 4 hours to be precise, and also ask it, because we are invited to the people of the sonar to discuss important matters. So I will be absent for the next 3 days, so tomorrow Florina will do the correction work.
So I am all the more pleased that you are coming here before you leave, because I have 2 or 3 more questions. The first is again about salt, which we discussed on the 5th of April, but we were unable to finish it because Injana called you and you had to leave immediately.
I also wanted to talk about this because in our last conversation on the 18th of April, we missed to talk about it again. So I will repeat some of the things I said and also explain them in the context of the human beings and salt. The human beings cannot live without salt. If their physical existence is impossible without this vital substance, because the human organism cannot produce the components of salt, chloride, and sodium by itself. Salt must therefore be taken in through food and drink or through a special supply, such as appropriate tablets and medicines, etc. If, however, the body is not supplied with enough salt. The normal requirement for an adult human being is between 3 and 4 grams. Then too much water is formed in the body, causing internal drowning, so to speak, or so-called hyponatremia. This happens especially when a lot of sweat is excreted and therefore a lot is drunk, but not also the necessary salt intake. Salt plays an important role in the regulation of fluid. But this is not the case with a large intake of fluid if it also lacks the salt content necessary for fluid regulation, or if the salt requirement is not covered separately by salt tablets. When the human beings are physically active and sweat a lot, there is inevitably an undersupply of sodium in the blood, or a dangerous reduction in the sodium concentration, which misleads the thirst center in the brain in such a way that there is no sodium deficiency in the fluid balance but an excess.
Sorry to interrupt, but the thirst center, what is it?
The thirst center, or subfornical organ, is a part of the hypothalamus, and as such is decisively involved in the regulation of the water balance. The thirst center is located at the back of the front part of the hypothalamus, near the third ventricle of the brain. The thirst center belongs to the so-called circumventricular organs, which lack a blood-brain barrier, so the messenger substances circulating in the blood are easily accessible. Thirst can be caused by several forms, either hormonal, osmotic, or volumetric. When blood osmolarity increases, water absorption increases in the liver area through the osmotic sensors in the thirst center. At the same time, the reabsorption of water in the kidney is increased because of the increased release of antidiuretic hormone from the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Volumetric thirst is caused by fluid loss through pressure receptors, mainly in the low-pressure system of the circulatory system, which are connected to the thirst center. It is also worth noting that fluid loss leads to activation of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. In this respect, the enzyme renin, which comes from the kidney, leads to the conversion of angiotensinogen into angiotensin first, which is then further converted into angiotensin II, which as the actual thirst hormone has a direct effect on the thirst center.
Excuse me, but I do not understand the terms used here. Subfornical organ and angiotensin. What should I understand by this and their function?
Let me explain further, and what you do not understand corresponds to earthly medical terms, which of course is not understandable for lay people. I can only briefly repeat that the subfornical organ or organum subfornical as I said before, is one of the circumventricular organs, which in its function is involved in the control of the body's salt and water balance. Angiotensin corresponds to a protein and acts as a transmitter. With regard to the hormone angiotensin II, the neurons are particularly sensitive. If blood pressure is too low, this hormone is produced by proteolysis through renin and conversion and by the angiotensin ACE, or the converting enzymes from the zymogen angiotensinogen. The whole thing is called the renin-angiotensin system. If blood pressure is too low, angiotensin II is activated. The subfornical organ sends out signals in response to the stimulus of angiotensin II via effects in the nucleus preopticus of the hypothalamus. The nucle.
That's enough. You do not have to explain more, because to understand it exactly I would have to have studied it, which I am not. So the explanation is quite enough to get a small impression. But thanks for your effort. Then you can please continue with your explanation where I interrupted you.
The fact is, if the brain is misled in such a way that there is no lack of sodium in the fluid balance, but rather an excess, then more and more is drunk, until the fluid finally penetrates from the bloodstream into the tissue, and there is water retention in the brain. This creates a very strong pressure which affects the respiratory center and eventually causes it to fail. This shows that there is very little space between a vital and a lethal dose of salt, which is not consciously taken into account by Earth humans, and consequently many people around the world die from a far excessive intake of salt. The excessive salt consumption of Earth humans can effectively be described as an epidemic that claims millions of human lives every year, which of course is not officially announced. It is a fact that an increased salt consumption over a longer period of time, on the one hand, rapidly raises the blood pressure, while at the same time the body and its organs are slowly drying out internally, which naturally leads to serious and life-threatening consequences for the heart and its activity, up to and including heart attacks. The great danger in the human being's consumption of salt is that they do not notice how much too much salt they ingest, mainly through industrially produced food. And what consumers of these foods do not know is that even sweet foods contain a lot of sugar and also a lot of hidden salt. Thus, some foods, sweet as well as sour and salty, are so oversugared and oversalted that the health of the body is severely impaired. Worldwide, but especially in the industrialized countries, the excess of salt is a creeping epidemic, causing millions of deaths every year, as I said, but this is deliberately concealed by food producers and the salt industry. Salt and also sugar lead to an addiction that is almost impossible to cure, because they trigger the same addictive processes in those genes of the cells in the brain as is the case with alcohol, drugs, and medicines. As a result, the addiction to salt increases over time, whereby more and more of this substance is consumed, and it is not noticed that the bodily functions of life are increasingly impaired until death finally occurs. Salt works like heroin and cocaine or other intoxicating drugs in the region of the brain that also plays a role in drug addicts, namely the hypothalamus. As with chemical drugs, the consumption of salt also causes the release of dopamine, or the reward messenger. The consequence of this is that the human beings who ingest salt are driven by the urge to feel the whole thing again. So they keep on ingesting more and more salt because this is what their brain demands. This leads to negative conditioning. And the more the salt addict ingests salt, the weaker he feels the reward effect, which in turn leads to the correct amount of salt consumption ultimately going completely out of control. There is still a lot to explain, but this should be enough to end this topic.
That should really be enough. Thanks for your explanations. So it is much easier said than done to eat less salt, because it is also an addictive drug, like drugs and alcohol.
Also like sugar, which as an addictive drug, just like salt, is increasingly demanded by the organism, even if it causes serious health problems or even death.
In this respect, I think we can speak of the brain, the body, and the whole organism as a salt and sugar junkie, just as we can with regard to alcohol, drugs, and intoxicating substances.
That is so.
Then I would like to talk about why you are not allowed to accept gifts from Earthlings, because I am always being asked to give you your daughter Simyase or Florena, etc. things. It is simply not to be understood that you are forbidden to do so because of the possible introduction of bacteria and viruses, etc. into Era. It is true that if you drink or eat chocolate with me, you will first have to neutralize it with your little device, and you will always be surrounded by your own personal shield, which will protect you from being infected by bacteria or viruses here on Earth. It should not be forgotten that when you are with me, this shield also neutralizes everything you come into contact with, including me.
On the one hand, our directives determine this in this way. On the other hand, we have to protect ourselves from all the earthly influences which are harmful to our health. Because the earth is full of dangers for us with regard to bacteria and viruses, etc. So we must be extremely careful not to come into contact with any germs that are harmful to our health or in any other way, so as not to endanger our own health on the one hand, but also to ensure that we do not introduce dangerous germs into our flying apparatus or onto Era and other of our worlds.
But how is it that you used to bring all kinds of things from Earth to Era?
This required special permissions, whereby the things, as you call them, had to remain in quarantine for several months in specially equipped flying apparatus, where all objects, but also animals and creatures, etc., were neutralized with regard to dangerous and harmful bacteria and viruses, as well as vermin, etc.
You could also do that today, couldn't you?
We could, but our directives prohibit it. In special and important cases, exemptions can be granted. But these are very strictly weighed and are hardly ever granted anymore, because in the past very bad experiences were made by importing objects, animals, and creatures, etc. to Era.
Then it is also clear now that when we come together you make me neutralized by vibrations each time, so to speak, and harmless to you in terms of bacteria and viruses. I knew this from the first meeting with Simyase, because she told me in confidence. But if we are now talking openly about it, then this can also be said in the end.
Which is nothing to object to.
What else interests me about the exemptions, when things from other worlds want to be imported into Era? To what extent are such exemptions granted? To which persons? And also for hobbies?
In principle, all persons can apply for exceptional permits, which as a rule are also granted, although all security precautions must be taken and observed. However, it is extremely rare that such applications are made, because there is no great need in our populations for things, objects, and any goods from other worlds. The interest is usually in things and goods that exist and are available on Era. If there is a need for goods which come from other worlds, and which are of era-planetary or era-volcanic necessity, then these goods will be imported under the same security conditions as those which also apply to the extremely rare imports which are applied for by private individuals with exceptional permission.
Quetzal and one of his friends have a hobby of terrestrial animals and vehicles. Are there others who have similar hobbies?
This is not the case as far as I know, because such incidents are registered by the world government, and no other person with the same hobby passions is mentioned in our records. Nevertheless, there are persons who collect various things from other worlds and are passionately connected to them. As I have said, this is very rare, because our people are more interested in our different cultures and all their connections to them than in things, objects, and goods from other worlds.
So then, every human being has the right, when he wishes or wants, to obtain things and goods from other worlds.
That is so, yes, but as I said before, such interests are extremely rare, because on Era we have everything that the human beings and the entire population need.
So the Erins are very frugal in this respect, but they are also frugal in other ways, aren't they?
That is so. Even if all errands have everything possible at their disposal, they are also content with what is simply necessary for them.
Which probably means that they do not overdo it in their demands, do not hoard, and do not grab all kinds of things, even though everything is available to them in good measure at their whim.
You said it.
Then a question about animals and creatures. At least with various animals that are kept on Earth in so-called zoological gardens and circuses, it seems to me that the animals do not behave naturally. Therefore, I suspect that the animals are immobilized with some kind of chemical means, or at least in circuses they are intimidated by tamers. Furthermore, in factory farms, and probably in zoos as well, the animals and the creatures are maltreated with antibiotics, and in factory farms the human being is also affected in the end. Do you know anything about this?
Yes, I have also made various observations in this regard and have investigated the matter, whereby I have established exactly what you have just assumed. On the one hand, the animals are sedated by chemical means, as they are constantly given, but also in large quantities, antibiotics to protect them against diseases. As a rule, animals infected with bacteria are often treated with antibiotics, but this is also wrongly done for disease prevention reasons, which is, of course, absurd. And this is happening in zoos as well as in circuses, and especially in livestock, which is considered to be a source of meat food for the human beings. As a result, however, intensive livestock farming poses a great health risk to human beings through antibiotics, because resistant germs develop in meat products. Unfortunately. However, the use of antibiotics is not generally prohibited in intensive earthly livestock farming, which means that there is extensive misuse of antibiotics, as is also the case with the human beings who, when they fall ill, are often irresponsibly prescribed antibiotics by doctors, usually to quickly regain their health and/or not to infect other persons. So this irresponsibility is kept that way in animal husbandry as well as in the human beings. Particularly in factory farming, it is irresponsibly argued that it is important that animals do not become ill, but should be treated immediately with antibiotics in excess, because otherwise they could quickly infect other animals, and in the worst-case scenario, the entire animal population. Antibiotic treatment may be justified on a case-by-case basis for a single sick animal, but not prophylactically for the entire herd, because it will contaminate the meat of the animals with antibiotics, including, of course, the meat of the animal which is maltreated in the same way as you say, with the result that meat contaminated with antibiotics will be put on the market, which is just as dangerous for the health of consumers as if the meat were contaminated with dangerous bacteria. If this happens, the worst-case scenario is that epidemics can spread. From this point of view, antibiotics are therefore indispensable in the fight against bacterial infections in animal production. But logic, reason, and common sense dictate that antibiotics should only be used to treat effectively given diseases and not in a prophylactic form. As with everything in life, the measure of medication to be used is also decisive in relation to the animals and the creatures. If, however, antibiotics are used in excess of the required dosage, resistance can develop throughout, which means that the animals as well as the creatures, and ultimately also the human being as a consumer of the antibiotic-infused meat, no longer respond to antibiotics when there is an urgent need for them. In this case, the bacteria can then spread unhindered and can no longer be fought with any means. This is why, since 2006, the use of antibiotics is only allowed within the EU in case of illness. Antibiotics should only be administered in proven cases of illness, but never prophylactically. So, Only one single animal suffering from a disease should be treated with an antibiotic, but not as a preventive measure. Also all the others, which are sometimes supplied with too many thousands per stable. Everything that the human being does to the animals and the creatures in relation to antibiotic abuse has a knock-on effect on the human beings, because excessive use of antibiotics automatically leads to resistance. So it is not only sick animals, but also animals or creatures which have been treated with antibiotics which pose a serious risk to the health of the human beings who consume meat. Meat contaminated with antibiotics therefore has an enormous impact on the human being's health. According to our research, it is undisputed that antibiotics in animal husbandry have a very large influence on antibiotic resistance in human beings, especially in cases where the same antibiotics are used. In the case of infections with so-called resistant germs in the human beings, these antibiotics can no longer help, so that infections are much more difficult to treat, if at all possible. The fact is that the time has now come when multi-resistant germs are spreading very rapidly around the world, and they can no longer be stopped because medical research has not yet produced any new antibiotics. As a result, the time has now come when even a simple and minor injury can lead to serious infection and death, as can a mild flu or other illness.
This looks bitter for the Earthlings, but they are not making sense, so the irresponsible abuse of antibiotics by factory farms and irresponsible doctors is likely to continue on the same catastrophic scale and on an increasing scale.
What will actually happen if governments and the responsible authorities do not finally take rigorous measures against the misuse of antibiotics and take the utmost care to ensure that antibiotics are no longer given to factory farms, but only to doctors with a doctorate in veterinary medicine?
It will certainly be a long time before such a regulation is adopted. Well, in the 467th Contact Report from the 28th of June 2008, Pleiadian Pleiadian Contact Reports, Volume 11, page 373, the following is written, which I have printed out. Then I have another question. Are you familiar with the story about Jack the Ripper?
Naturally.
There are many versions of who this murderer was, but nobody knows anything about it. I also once asked one of you, but I don't remember who I asked and what the answer was. I searched all the recorded contact conversations, but I couldn't find anything about who the killer was or what was said. Do you know who Jack the Ripper was?
It seems that there was a private conversation about why there is no record of it, but I know nothing about such an official conversation. But regarding Jack the Ripper, it is without doubt that it was a man who had fallen into a degenerate sexuality, which he performed on prostitutes and then murdered them using a dagger, a small sword, and poison. He also took organs from the dead, which he cooked and ate. He was born in Canada, lived for some time in the USA, and then in England. The man's name was Thomas Neill Cream, and he was a trained physician, but after several murders he came under suspicion, was arrested, charged, and sentenced to death, after which he was hanged in 1892. At the same time, however, a second man was at work in the same way, who prosecuted the royal house of Queen Victoria, but was never caught because he managed to evade justice and stopped his bloody activities after Thomas Neill Cream was arrested.
A copycat. That's what we call copycats. At the 524th official contact conversation on the 30th of July 2011, we also spoke again about the same thing, but I am still interested in this matter. For example, on the internet his country of birth is mentioned as Scotland, whereas you said he was born in Canada. Recently, however, someone telephoned me and told me that the serial killer Thomas Neill Cream was a Scottish-born man, and that he was also considered the first serial killer in modern legal history.
That regarding the birth is not correct, because he was actually born in Canada, where his mother, in a very pregnant condition, was visiting an acquaintance and was looking for a suitable place where her family could settle, because they wanted to move from Scotland to Canada. The whole thing was carried out in a secret operation, so even the neighborhood of the Cream family knew nothing about it, and they were also not supposed to know. Consequently, it was told that the mother was staying with a relative who was ill and needed nursing care. So, when the time came, the mother gave birth to Thomas Neill in Canada, after which she returned to Scotland and announced the birth of her son, and also registered the birth in Glasgow on the 27th of May, 1850, hiding the fact that the birth had taken place in Canada. No one was to know that the family wanted to emigrate to Canada. So secret arrangements continued to be made for the emigration, which also took place 4 years later. Thomas Neill Cream was then hanged as a serial killer in the United Kingdom on the 15th of November, 1892, in Newgate Prison in London. In fact, he was not the only serial killer of the time who committed his murders in England, but also in Australia and Brazil, for there was another one who was up to his murderous mischief. Namely a grandson of Queen Vicotria, Prince Albert Victor, who murdered prostitutes because he was secretly courting them and feared that they would discredit him publicly. But at the same time, there was a third man who spread fear and terror as a serial killer. Namely a certain Frederick Bailey Deeming, who was born on the 30th of July, 1853, and hanged on the 23rd of May, 1892. He also murdered his families and did his mischief in Australia, Paris, and South America. He also murdered several prostitutes, although it was only revealed that he cruelly killed his 4 children and 2 wives. Neither was he Jack the Ripper, nor Prince Albert Victor, for Thomas Neill Cream was in fact the man who was given this title.
So there was not only one serial killer at work in the same period, but there were 3.
That is correct. This is also proven by my father's notes in this regard, which I studied.
So then Svoth was following and recording such events.
That is the case.
Well, then I have something else. Once again, I would like to talk about black matter, because the earthly astrophysicists are still bickering about what it might be, but they just don't get to the point. We have talked about this matter several times, but you have always said that you are not allowed to give any information about it. What we have talked about in our contacts so far is this, which I have copied out.
467th contact, the 28th of June, 2008.
You can.
The dark matter in the universe, we have talked about it several times, but it was always in a private way, so nothing was ever written about it in the contact reports. You also kept me silent about this topic. The last time was about 5 years ago. Is it still not allowed to say anything about it? I mean, what is the function of dark matter and what do you call it?
There is no need to remain silent about it, so you can openly reveal your knowledge.
Which you could also do, but if you think that I should say something about it, then please do. If I remember correctly, you call dark matter expansion substance, and this has the property that it also expands every solar system, every galaxy, and the entire universe. Black matter is therefore an expanding matter, so to speak.
That is correct.
471st contact, the 16th of September, 2008.
Your assumption is correct that black holes can only form in the belt of matter because only in this belt are the necessary conditions available through which they can form. In the other matter-less universe belts, the formation of black holes is not possible.
Aha, then the case is clear. Therefore, certain physical factors are necessary for this, such as vibrations or radiation. Dark matter and fine matter, which compress and thus become so dense that they become an enormously heavy mass and develop an enormous gravity, and thus an attraction of gigantic strength.
I am not allowed to give any information about this.
535th contact, the 4th of February, 2012.
That is unfortunately the truth.
Then the question is whether you can tell me the mass ratio with regard to all the coarse matter and dark matter in the universe, or whether you are also not allowed to do so.
There is no secrecy for that. The dark matter in the entire universe is about 7 times more in terms of mass than the total mass of all other forms of matter.
435th contact, the 5th of October, 2006.
All gross material matter of all kinds renews itself, thus creating new galaxies, stars and planets, etc., during this transformation, which takes place over a period of about 2 billion years. Certain residues remain, which are also deposited in the transition zone and in the matter belt as dark energy and as particulate dark matter, which can be captured and measured using special techniques. This dark matter, therefore, has a much higher age than the actual coarse matter of the visible matter belt or the visible part of the universe, which Earth humans erroneously refer to as the universe, although this matter belt only makes up a 7th part of the effective universe.
515th contact, the 7th of March, 2011.
Dark matter, which is still very mysterious to earthly scientists, also plays a certain role, especially with regard to the transport of the sun's hot energy, because without the influence of dark matter, this would not be possible.
Here is my question. On the one hand, you say that dark matter is an expanding substance or matter, but on the other hand, you also once said that only through dark matter is gravity possible and can function. Isn't that a contradiction? Somehow I just do not understand the whole thing. It confuses me.
As far as I am allowed to make a statement, I will explain the following. Dark matter is an interactive mass, which means that it is massive particles which, measured in the atomic range, have an enormous weight. These massive particles have an interaction that is related to both gravity and expansion force, which is why I explained that dark matter is expansion matter, although I did not mention that it is also gravity matter. So without the dark matter, there would be neither centrifugal force nor gravity. So without gravity, no expansion substance can exist, and without expansion matter, no gravity. Both factors, centrifugal force and gravity, are everywhere, but they are only perceptible and therefore also measurable but not visible because they radiate neither light nor darkness visible to the eye. I am not allowed to explain more about this.
So far I understand what you are saying, but I would be interested to know how it works and other connections, as well as whether dark matter also exists in the black holes, which seems logical to me. Although I also know, because you told me, that there are small and large black holes in the whole space of the universe, apart from the central black holes at the center of the galaxies.
I am not allowed to explain further about dark matter, but with regard to black holes, I can say once again that they exist in almost incalculable numbers throughout the universe, and also in free space. So there are large ones that comprise or contain millions of times the masses of the sun, while others are small and almost puny, as you once said, because they do not cover even 1 cubic meter. And of course, black holes also contain dark matter.
What do you think about the fact that terrestrial astronomers are pretending to have made a complete inventory of our darn universe?
That is ridiculous, because the fact is that they are so far incapable of even taking stock of the material belt of the universe in its entire size and extent, let alone all the remaining 6 belts of whose existence they have no idea.
They just poke around in small parts of the material belt and imagine that what they see is the whole universe. They have no idea about the real structure and its immeasurable size and vastness. Effectively, they are still in their infancy with their knowledge.
Can we briefly discuss something in private, something that only...
Naturally, no problem.